My name is Scott Dill, and I'm on the business development team here at Real Story Group. Our company founder and lead web content management analyst, Tony Byrne, will be on the line in a moment to guide us through what to expect in the coming year. For those of you that are new to Real Story Group, what you'll likely notice about us right away is that we're quite different than traditional analyst firms you may have worked with in the past. First, our philosophy isn't to rank who's the best or who's the worst vendor, but rather the focus of our research is to help you select a technology that's going to be the right fit for your specific use cases. Much like when you're buying a car, your needs are going to be unique from the next person that walks into that dealership. And buying a technology solution is much more expensive than buying a new car, so you want to make sure that you're making the right investment the very first time. Our analysts have developed a reputation that they're quite fond of, and that's being the toughest critics in this particular marketplace. We're able to be that way because we've developed a very unique model in the market research world by doing no work for the vendors we evaluate. We don't speak at their conferences, we don't advise them on their strategy, and we won't accept money from them for special treatment in our research. Our sole purpose as an organization is to be an unbiased advocate for technology users and buyers and provide a pull no punches description of what's going to be the right technology fit for our customers and help them measure how effective they are with the products that they already have in place. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Tony, who will be guiding us through the heart of the presentation. Tony?
Great, thanks, Scott. I really love this time of year because we start thinking a little bit more about the future. And, you know, we spend probably 11 months of our year, 10 to 11 months, really focused on how you can select the right tools and make the right choices, as the technology that's here. This gives us a chance to sort of look forward. And it's always interesting with these predictions, is it a prediction or is it an aspiration? And I think sometimes as analysts, we sort of maybe talk about things we wish would happen. And I'm just going to be honest and say that some of my predictions too today, that they're aspirational as well, that they're things that I wish for you is that this would happen. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but I'll be clear about where there's a difference there. So I'll tell you all 7 of them right up front, 7 trends that we think will happen in 2017, and then we'll go through each one. So the first one is, there's been a lot of talk this year about content as a service. I think next year we're going to be thinking maybe a little bit more as experience as a service, particularly in sort of these headless models. So I'll describe a little bit more there. I think we're going to see a lot more growing complexity, which is generally, it can be a good thing, but is often a bad thing because it can be more developer intensivity amid the products. In terms of cloud, of course, you have various choices. We see a lot of evolution happening in the Paas area, or platform as a service. And what we also see is a trend with more and more web content and experience management vendors wanting to be your marketing data warehouse as well, and I have some very strong thoughts about that. I think we'll see some backlash against advanced personalization, that the marketplace is way ahead of what we can do here. I'm going to talk a little bit about a vendor that we don't talk much about when it comes to marketing technology, and that's Microsoft. And I have a feeling they may go somewhere in this space next year, which will then lead us into the last thing, which is hopefully we will see more capabilities around shareable micro experiences. So these, I think, are 7 overall trends. So the first one is really talking first about content as a service, and almost any WCM tool can do this now. Usually this is a sort of a, through some kind of a REST interface, so this is going to be a little bit technical, but what you see on the left is just a JSON feed that almost any web content management system can generate to then just send plain old text to, say, an application. So like a e-commerce application or a financial services application. And marketers are really excited about this because they want to be able to inject content into transactional environments or into places where people are actually interacting as opposed to just sort of static or even dynamic marketing sites per se. So this is all really good, and this actually isn't really that hard to execute now on a typical web content management platform. The problem is that marketers don't always have much control over what happens on the other end, and they want to. They want to be able to preview what is this going to look like, or maybe they want to introduce some different display logic or some different layout and potentially some personalization or some A/B testing, and it's just static text that I'm throwing out there. And then I've got to go back to the developers to work on the application, and that's a hassle. I want to be able to control that in the CMS. So I think what you're going to see more of going forward is what we might call experience as a service, where I'm actually delivering a block of HTML, potentially with some logic in it, maybe some A/B testing, some other things. So I'm actually delivering a rendered component. So it's not a whole page, but I'm actually controlling the experience around that component within the CMS, even though that experience is going to be delivered in some kind of an application environment. So I think this is really a big trend. Here is where the vendors generally have not executed particularly well. I hope and wish that we'll see better execution. Certainly the marketplace is driving us more towards experience as a service. Now, there's a whole set of issues around this from, of course, the technology standpoint, but also for those of you who are marketers and editors, one of the things you immediately want to be able to do is to understand that when you make changes in the CMS, what happens with the actual, the different endpoints. How are those changes going to be reflected? And maybe it's even just a mobile application. So one of the big issues is going to be around preview, a multi-channel preview. And I have to say that most CMS vendors are very bad at this. One interesting player, Core Media, it's kind of a niche player, does this pretty well, where you see here on the left, there's all these different endpoints. And then on the right, you see what you preview that chunk or that dynamic component of what it's actually going to appear. Now, it's not actually previewing it in the application environment. That takes a little bit more wiring, but at least you can kind of understand, okay, this is what this same content, how it's going to be rendered in different ways for different environments. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is really around complexity. So this is our marketplace diagram. These are the vendors that we cover in our WCM research, circa 2016. There's a lot of ways to slice and dice the marketplace, including by geography, by license type, by delivery model, so on and so forth. In a two-dimensional rendering like this, we tend to think that complexity is the best measure. Now, using our interactive tools, you can slice and dice the market all kinds of different ways and generate your own research reports and your own charts and PowerPoints. But if we're just going to look at this as a flat two-dimensional almost, screen here, we think the best way to understand the marketplace is on a complexity spectrum, where on the far left, you have the most complex, expensive, and feature-rich and extensible platforms. And then on the far right, you have simpler, more readily deployable, often, very readily multi-tenant type solutions. And then there's a whole spectrum of everything in between. The lower left is what we call legacy platforms. Those are tools that used to be big, really from big vendors that are kind of slipping out of the marketplace. And we like to say these are tools more that you leave than you actually buy. But you can see here, we put this red line in between, kind of dividing products versus platforms. And the general advice that we give to people is that anything to the left in the platform area, you better have at least one, ideally two, in-house developers who are trained and certified on the platform. On the products, you can often get away through browser-based configurations or turning to the occasional sort of outside consultant. But what we're seeing here, as digital demands become more intense, we're seeing the platforms start to become a little bit more, we're seeing all the products start to sort of move, I'll say, shift left a little bit, and this line of where you need a developer, we think in 2017 is going to actually move to the right, so that these products are going to become more developer intensive. Even with WordPress now, you really need to have somebody who's kind of expert in the platform if you're going to do agile type adjustments and marketing. And so I'm guessing that early next year, we're probably going to start calling these lower end platforms. So we're talking about a lot of platforms here, fewer out-of-the-box products. This has a lot of implications for you, including making sure that you have the capabilities, at least some in-house, to be able to modify those platforms to adjust to what your constituents need. The other thing that I think we'll see happen in 2017 in this regard is that the legacy platforms are having, with so much innovation, the legacy platforms are really having trouble keeping up. So if you look in the lower left there, I have a feeling in some of these cases, we may even stop covering them. I mean, it's useful to know their pros and cons if they're already an incumbent vendor with you, but they're really falling out of the marketplace. The bottom line here is that it's really important to sort of understand what your own capabilities are. And so you can use our Real Score benchmarking tool, which you can try out for free on our site, to actually sort of score yourself and sort of say, okay, well, where am I in terms of my overall capacity to execute on this stuff? And then that might help you as well. But then always remember that there's no single best tool or best category for you, that you really want to take your own requirements, your own geography, most importantly, the use cases, your tolerance for risk, and other strategic intangibles. And again, you can use our tool to help out there. It's called Real Quadrant. So it's not a static quadrant, but actually deliver a dynamic quadrant for you. But any way you slice it, you know, the ecosystem around these tools is going to matter even more. And that's just, again, because of the sort of platformization of this stuff that, you know, you really are going to have to, focus on not just the tool itself, not just the vendor, but what customer community I'm joining, what about consulting and services partners, and a lot of other intangibles. And again, our tools allow you to sort of weight these things differently, but clearly it's increasingly important. Okay. So just to remind you, you can ask questions in the GoToMeeting control panel, and so we've already got one from Mark. What attributes do you do to assign a solution as a product rather than a platform? And you know, Mark, it's a number of different factors, and it's never always as clean as we would like, but it revolves around, you know, do you really need a developer to make this thing work? Can it handle things like multi-site management effectively? Does it support things like localization? Will it support dynamic content delivery natively? These sorts of things. So a lot of it is it really out of the box, or does it take some significant tweaking to get it going? David is asking, content is always going to be interweaved, whether static or dynamic. How does an owner or creator of content protect their IP and authenticate the content beyond any doubt? Well, you know, this is an interesting question. It really relates to, it's a little bit out of scope for this session, David, but it really relates to, you know, downstream digital rights management and being able to, you know, control your content. I think the other thing, too, is to make sure that anyone who's getting access to your JSON feed, that they have the right keys and authority to be able to do that. Just because you're making your content repository available to others doesn't mean that you're going to let everybody come in and get it. Instead, it's really more the different partners that you have within your own enterprise who want to get access to your content and your micro experiences, and have the rights and authorization and the keys to be able to do that. Okay, so prediction number 3 is of course around cloud, increasingly important. And this is a short chart that we like to use that show the various models here. You might quibble with some little details, but it's a good kind of overall distinction between traditional IT, where you manage this whole stack, and then infrastructure as a service, where, you know, someone like Amazon or Azure or Rackspace takes care of everything in gray, and you manage the stuff in blue. And then platform as a service, you know, the vendor's managing even more. And in software as a service, you just take whatever is delivered, right? Maybe you can make some little configuration changes, but software as a service is essentially really a product, often done in a multi-tenant way. That works for some people, not for others. What we're really seeing is the emergence of different PaaS, or platform as a service solution. And then in particular, we're seeing vendors do this themselves. And the big thing that's pushing them to do this is they want that recurring revenue stream. So it's interesting because this is going back to the days where a lot of vendors wanted to also be your hosting company. And in many cases, that didn't turn out so well. So we're going to see just how well this turns out. I think I might wish for you more an environment where it was more their integration partners who were doing this. And in some cases they are, but they're also, it's a little tricky for them because they're competing with vendors who are trying to get this revenue themselves. So I think that there's a lot of interest in PaaS. There's a lot of potential benefits here. But I think this is going to be the big conversation in 2017. Does this really work for you to have your vendor also be providing essentially your support for your cloud environment or not. So a number of key issues that we've been talking about with our subscribers around this, including who gets to push stuff into production, which is a big deal, and how quickly, who's responsible for what tier, is the supplier really experienced at delivering, this type of service on a 24/7 basis? The other thing that you need to be careful about is that a lot of vendors who do platform as a service, they also have these SaaS-based add-ons for things like personalization and search and content syndication, and you have to be careful about those, that they're not totally locking you in. In a platform as a service environment, you can always take your application back on-prem or take it to a different environment potentially, but software as a service, you're really locked in. So you need to be careful there about these sort of combo packages. And then the other thing that is often a big discussion point is maybe you already have an existing relationship like with an Amazon or an Azure, and so maybe you want to fold it in and manage it more that way. So you've got a lot of choices, but clearly platform as a service is becoming ascendant, and you have to sort of take that into consideration. Okay, fourth prediction. So we're going to see more of something that we're not a big fan of, and that is your vendor trying to be a marketing data warehouse. So a couple examples here. This Sitecore on the left, Sitefinity on the right. And the idea is that they want to suck in all of this customer data and CRM data and ad data and social data and aggregate all that data and then have you make decisions based on that across multiple channels, which is a nice idea, but you've got to ask yourself, is the WCM vendor, is this really where I want to be aggregating all of this data? And we would tend to argue no. Clearly one of the things that gets pitched is some of the simplicity here, that you can build and measure campaigns all in one place. The reality is that you're never going to be able to use these tools to be as multi-channel as you would like, and their data analysis is never going to be as good as what you can get from other analytics tools or other data mining solutions. Is it expedient? Yes. Is it particularly wise from an application perspective? I think we'll continue to argue probably not, and that what you really want is a proper separation of concerns. So those of you who have been subscribers have been able to play around with our digital marketing reference model. I won't go into great detail about this. You can find other archived webinars that talk about this, but I want to just take your eyes to the bottom here, where we make a really strong distinction between enterprise data and then the content and engagement layers that then drive through different delivery services to your channel. To the extent possible, you want to separate the data from your content and engagement management layer. All of these vendors, and especially the marketing automation vendors, also want to be your marketing data warehouse, and you really don't want them to do that. You really want to keep your data pristine and clear, have different types of data warehouses for different purposes potentially, and then leverage that data across multiple different channels. So it's a separation of data and content, which again takes a little bit more work, but in the long run is going to be a much more readily sustainable architecture for you. So the other big trend that we're going to see is around personalization. Personalization, of course, increasingly popular, but also very tricky. Vendors joke about this, that they have this demos really well. No one ever does it. So I think one of the areas in particular where you're seeing a lot of really cool demos is around this sort of advanced behavioral-based personalization, where if it's after 3 p.m. in the user's local environment and it's raining in their weather, if it's raining outside, then serve them this different type of content or add them to a different profile. And this kind of behavioral personalization, again, it demos very well. Hardly everyone does it. One of the reasons why they do it is becoming very difficult to manage in the editorial environment, and the analytics around this are still very, very sparse. So I think what we're going to see in 2017 is at least around customers. We'll see how vendors respond around customers saying, I want to do the basics. I want to be able to do segmented. I have these segments of customers and prospects. I want to just leverage these simple segments, and I want to leverage these 5, and I want to do it really well. Give me a simple interface to do that well, as opposed to this advanced interface to do personalization poorly, right? So I think that, again, this comes back to various issues around, can you really test and simulate and tell me, is this person actually in my store right now? Okay, in theory, that's all really cool. In practice, most teams aren't really set up to execute on this. Okay, sixth one, and I know some questions are coming in, and I guarantee you we'll have time to address them. It's on Microsoft. Microsoft has been really, I think, particularly since 2010, really focused a lot on digital workplace, not so much digital marketing, and you know that recently they've put almost all of their energy into getting you into Office 365. Yes, they're still supporting SharePoint on-premise, but I think this idea of SharePoint as a website, as a web server platform for public-facing scenarios, that whole notion has really bitten the dust. And now, of course, you have SharePoint in Office 365. And one thing that's missing in Office 365 is you also probably know that Microsoft deprecated SharePoint publishing sites. So you don't really use Office 365 as a publishing platform for digital marketing engagement. So if you're looking for WCM and Microsoft in going forward in the future, this is probably not the place to look for it. The more interesting stuff is happening around Microsoft Dynamics, which is originally their sort of mid-market CRM platform. It's gotten more sophisticated over the years, and they've added some marketing capabilities on top of it, including down here you can see these sorts of landing pages. And I think that it's probably not a small step from here to go to having to need some web content and experience management capabilities. To the extent that Microsoft either develops that or acquires it, it's likely to come out of the Dynamics group rather than the SharePoint group. So here's, Microsoft's sort of self-driven view of the world. Of course, it never really works quite like this. But, in terms of the execution, they've got marketing, resource management, digital asset management, multi-channel campaign, but interesting, no web content and experience management there. So obviously that's something that's lacking. And I wouldn't be surprised if Microsoft did pull the trigger on this and either acquire or build something. On the other hand, people have often thought this about Microsoft, and they don't have a great track record in some of the tools that they have acquired, although I would argue that Dynamics was probably a success. So we'll see what happens here. I just have this funny feeling. I don't have any insider dope on this, but I have this funny feeling something will happen. Now, in particular, I think what Microsoft would be interested in would be helping to create these sorts of shareable micro experiences, maybe rather than full sites. And I think this is the other thing that we're going to see as a really big trend next year is WCM vendors taking a cue from some of the social sharing services that are out there and some of the content marketing platforms that are designed to allow even contractors and others to engage in a very simple content and experience management and then push out these components, particularly if you're looking at experience as a service, to have these components that can be shared across different contexts. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see WCM vendors maybe even acquiring some content marketing capabilities or building these things in. It's right now you can do things like clone microsites, and that's all useful, but really in terms of supporting shareable micro experiences, I think this is something it's a wave that's breaking, and I would expect the vendors to really try to get on top of that, and I think that we'll see some innovation. So with that, those are the 7 predictions, and if you have any predictions yourselves, I'll invite you to put them into the questions tab on the GoToMeeting control panel. And while I'm just sorting through some of those questions, Scott's going to fill you in on next steps.
Great. Thanks, Tony. It's great to learn about what we should be expecting in the web content management world in 2017, and we'll be sure to check in around this time next year to hear what to look forward to for 2018. Our webinars and research samples are really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the content we have available to help you make smart technology choices. We're so grateful to have had the opportunity to work with organizations that range from 1 employee to 15 of Fortune's top 20 and companies of all sizes in between. What's exciting is that when you become a subscriber, we can then share those experiences with you about what went well and also where things have gone wrong to provide you with additional guidance as you navigate through your digital journey. We have research subscription plans available for all budget sizes, and we'd welcome the opportunity to learn more about how we can help you. And as part of that discussion, we're happy to take you on a quick behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience and show you the tools that Tony mentioned earlier. If that's something you'd like to schedule, or if you have any follow-up questions about the webinar, please don't hesitate to reach out to us by emailing us at explore@realstorygroup.com or give us a call at one of the numbers that's on the screen right now. In the meantime, it looks
Great.
like there are a few more immediate questions for Tony.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Scott. So, hi, Julie. Good to see you on the webinar with us today. You've got a really interesting question. Why do we put Episerver in the mid-range category? Is it based on price? Their functionality certainly looks on par with Core Media. And Core Media, you recall, we had in the sort of upper tier. And Julie, these boundaries are a little bit porous. You could argue one way or another. I think we would consider Episerver not quite as functionally rich as Core Media. Core Media does some really interesting things, both in the editorial interface and in the delivery environment that are more complex and more sophisticated than what Epi does. And yes, it costs more. So that's part and parcel of how we're breaking these things down. Of course, a lot of it depends on how you're going to use it and extend it. We've seen people do really sophisticated stuff with Episerver, and we've seen people do really simple stuff with more complicated tools just because they overbought. And I think, Julie, that's really the big thing here, that you run a greater risk of overbuying this technology than underbuying this technology now more than ever. And so it's really important to have a conversation around being clear with yourself and your team about just how you're going to be able to exploit those capabilities, because extra capabilities mean extra user experience and performance complications and all sorts of other things. So really good question, Julie. Shashank, good to see you again, is asking about content as a service versus, experience as a service. And how do you manage presentation across different applications which consume the content? JSON, it's easy, we leave that to the application, but when we move to experience as a service, how do you see it evolving? And that's a great question. I mean, obviously the poor man's way is to just do a simple iframe, right? And so you iframe in this content. The other way to do this is to go directly to the API and get more of a rendered content. And in some cases, you can do that through REST. In other cases, you go directly to the API so that the CMS actually runs through its logic, may generate some CSS to go with it, and so on and so forth. And we've seen a lot of interesting ways of doing this. Obviously, it can be done on a push basis, but also on a pull basis, right? And this can be on a pulled basis. So I'm just getting the latest one at night and then caching it within my application. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. But I think you're right in general, Shashank, that the sophistication around this isn't quite as simple or advanced as you see with just a plain old text JSON feed. So Gregory's got a question. He's asking about headless CMS trend will also extend into digital asset management. Headless CMS means that you're just managing the content in the background, irrespective of the actual target environment. It's not actually delivering the site, so that is content as a service, essentially. And Gregory, from what we've seen, almost every digital asset management system is headless. What's interesting about DAM, which is a whole other area that we cover, is that we're starting to see some of the DAMs wanting to become, how should I put it, headful, putting a head on them. So historically, they've been just these kind of asset repositories that live in the background and push things out to delivery environments. Now we're starting to see through brand portals and others, DAM environments become delivery platforms, and whether this is good or bad depends exactly on your particular circumstances. Gregory's also wondering about cloud CMS. Any reason for excluding them? No, there's probably 40 or 50 other content management systems that are available and are reasonably well known around the world that we don't cover. We try to cover the top, what we describe as the top 40 most prevalent. We could debate about that, but what our subscribers tell us is not so much that, hey, I want more choices, but instead I want to know how can I narrow down all of these incredible choices in front of me. Sebastian's got a really interesting question here, one I think that we explore almost every week with you folks, which is how do we see the epic battle between suite versus best-of-breed vendors developing? this is one of the I would say that this is the question that lies in the background of a lot of the advisory calls that we do with our enterprise subscribers when they want to make key decisions. This whole notion of suite versus best of breed. It's a big deal in the digital workplace. It's an even bigger deal in the digital marketing realm. And we tend to see better outcomes from more best of breed than suite, but there's pros and cons, and I'm going to give you the simple answer, which is, of course, it depends. I think my only caveat is to be very careful to understand that just because you're buying a number of tools from a single vendor like Oracle or IBM or Adobe doesn't mean that they're particularly well integrated. Okay, so let's see. Timothy is saying, hi, my priorities are both marketing and the need for flexibility in mid to high range platforms. I'm thinking of Sitecore versus Acquia Drupal. What do you think? Functionally, they're two very similar platforms. In terms of their business model and delivery and architecture, they could hardly be different. So they're two very, very different choices. You can go compare them in our tooling and get much more detail about their strengths and weaknesses. They are going to demo very similarly in terms of their capabilities, but particularly Acquia with its lift, which was in some ways almost kind of patterned after some of the things that Sitecore does. But trust me, very different companies, very different delivery models, very different architectures, very different business models. We could spend a long time contrasting them. So I see we've actually run a little bit over, so wanted to thank everyone for sticking around, and feel free to follow up with us directly if you have any questions, and certainly look forward to engaging you more deeply and hope that you will consider becoming subscribers. So for Real Story Group and Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne saying goodbye and have a great rest of your week.